Okay, they're back. Yep, they're back. You know, in the economic turmoil of the 1930s, something called fascism swept across Europe, took a hold in Germany and Italy, and eventually threw the entire planet into a world war. Fascism is the merging of government and corporate interests. Very simple, very straightforward, with a tinge of nationalism and a little bit of racism thrown in to keep the population in line and united against a perceived enemy, a them, an other. As Mussolini was dissolving Parliament in 1938 and setting up his Camera de Fasci della Corporazione? I don't know. I can't speak Italian, but close enough. The Chamber of Fascist Corporations is what it would be called in English. Italian philosopher Giovanni Gentile argued that fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it hands government off to corporations. So in 1944, the vice president of the United States at that time, Henry Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt's VP in 1944, was asked by the New York Times, what about fascists in America? And in answer to that question, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about the dangers of fascism and the threat that fascists posed to the United States. He wrote, fascism, this is the Vice President of the United States speaking, in 1944. Fascism is a worldwide disease. Its greatest threat to the United States will come after the war within the United States itself. Another fascist danger is represented by those who, paying lip service to democracy and the common welfare, in their insatiable greed for money and the power which money gives, do not hesitate surreptitiously to evade the laws designed to safeguard the public from monopolistic extortion. Despite the warnings by Vice President Henry Wallace, and he genuinely believed at that time that the American system government was strong enough to avoid becoming fascistic, to avoid becoming a corporate state. At that time, it was pretty much unheard of that a CEO would run for political office. In Wallace's view, politicians knew that their obligation was to represent we the people and protect us from the corporate cartels. Wallace continued in his article for the New York Times, happily, he wrote, it can be said that as yet, fascism has not captured a predominant place in the outlook of any American section, class, or religion. It may be encountered in Wall Street, Main Street, or Tobacco Road. Some even suspect that they can detect incipient traces of it along the Potomac. But if we put our trust in the common sense of common men, and with malice toward none and charity for all, go forward on the great adventure of making political, economic, and social democracy a practical reality, we shall not fail. A year later, the fascists in Europe were defeated by Henry Wallace and Franklin Roosevelt, among others. And the fascists in America were banished to the political wilderness as Roosevelt's New Deal revolution really took hold. But today, 4 generations later, the fascists are back. And we need to revisit a poignant warning that Vice President Wallace had for us in 1944 when he wrote for the New York Times, American fascism will not be really dangerous until there is a purposeful coalition among the cartelists, the deliberate poisoners of public information, and those who stand for the KKK type of demagoguery. End of quote. This fascist coalition of corporate cartels, an entire television network devoted to disinformation and right-wing demagoguery, is stronger today in America than ever before. We now have an open corporatist. Corporations are people, my friend. An open corporatist, Mitt Romney, running for the highest office in the land. Romney fits Wallace's description of a fascist perfectly. He's a man who pays lip service to democracy and the common welfare, but in his insatiable greed evades laws that protect the common welfare by stealing pensions from and then laying off thousands of American workers and closing American factories just to make hundreds of millions of dollars as head of the pirate equity firm Bain Capital. And other corporatists, fascists, from banksters to oil barons to corporate front groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce pledging to spend over $1 billion to make sure their front man is elected in November. What would you call that? Well, Vice President Wallace, in his New York Times op-ed, defines the American fascists this way. Quote, they claim to be super patriots, but they would destroy every liberty guaranteed by the Constitution. They demand free enterprise, but they are the spokesman for monopoly and vested interest. Their final objective, toward which all their deceit is directed, is to capture political power so that using the power of the state and the power of the market simultaneously, they may keep the common man in eternal subjection. End of quote from the Vice President of the United States in 1944. And the corporate cartel now has the help of those who Wallace called the deliberate poisoners of public information, his phrase. The corporatist media outlets on cable news, led by Fox So-Called News, along with the corporatist agents in the right-wing blogosphere and right-wing talk radio. Wallace wrote, the American fascists are most easily recognized by their deliberate perversion of truth and fact. Their newspapers and propaganda carefully cultivate every fissure of disunity, every crack in the common front against fascism. They use every opportunity to impugn democracy. And this strategy, by the way, the Vice President Wallace identified in 1944, continues with today's purveyors of hate, who appear regularly on these same corporatist media outlets. They include the Islamophobes, the religious zealots who rail against gays, and the economic elites who try to pit working Americans against each other, the private worker against the public worker, the union worker against the non-union worker, the male worker against the female worker. They're all about making a split, divide and conquer. Quote Scott Walker. So nearly 70 years after the Vice President's warning, after Vice President Henry Wallace's warning, we now know that it can happen here. That we, too, can be taken over by fascism. And to some extent, we already have been. And considering what fascism did to the world the last time it took power, we should all be concerned about the next few years in America and the very real challenges we face as we try to reclaim our democracy and our economy. This is arguably the most high-stakes struggle for American democracy that we have seen since the founding of the Republic. I realize we fought a civil war, we fought a couple of world wars. The Civil War was probably a bigger one. Well, not probably, certainly was. You had people killing their own brothers. But is there anybody alive today who can remember a time when Americans were so polarized? This high-stakes struggle to preserve American democracy against the forces of fascism, it begins today. And you have to show up and participate. Right? Movement politics is what makes all these things work. We need to get involved. It's not enough to just sit around. It's not enough to just vote. 15 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So I'm calling it out. I'm calling it fascism when you have one of the biggest, most wealthy banksters in the United States running for the presidency. What do you call it?